Oh, great, thank you. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this technical working group meeting for the safety culture assessment rulemaking. This is our fifth technical working group meeting for this proceeding, and this meeting will be focused on the draft framework for conducting the safety culture assessments. So this is just a quick overview of the goals for this meeting. Our goal for this meeting is to work on building consensus for the draft safety culture framework and to communicate the next steps for the draft safety policy division staff proposal. Here's a quick look at our agenda for today. So we have 3 hours. We're going to have some opening remarks followed by a few presentations from the safety policy division and from parties. Then we'll have a break and a longer discussion session before we adjourn. As you already heard, this meeting is being recorded, and we will distribute the slides and recording for the meeting following the meeting. If you have questions during the meeting, you can either use your raised hand function or you can type questions into the chat. Either is fine with us. And we also have that Q&A session at the end. So if there's any questions that we don't get to throughout the meeting, we'll reserve them for that longer session. And here's just a visual of what I just said. If you're unfamiliar with WebEx, so your mute and unmute buttons and your video options are at the bottom of your screen. There's also the little hand for raising or lowering your hand. And use the chat and the Q&A towards the bottom right of the screen. All right, so today we have Commissioner Houck, the lead commissioner for this proceeding, and Director Caroline Thomas-Jacobs from the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety with us. So we're gonna start off with some opening remarks from both of them, and I'll pass it to Commissioner Houck first.
Thank you, Emma, and I just wanna say good morning and welcome everyone to today's technical working group. As Emma said, we're going to be going over the safety culture framework that was sent out earlier this month to the service list. We're also going to hear from the parties, Cal Advocates, and the investor-owned utilities regarding their recommendations on the framework. I know we don't have a lot of time this morning, so I'm going to keep my comments very short and just say that this is foundational to what we're doing. I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone today and basically here to listen and learn from all of you and ask some questions where warranted. And with that, I will turn it back over to Emma, and again, look forward to hearing from everyone this morning.
Thank you, Commissioner Houck. And now I'll pass it over to Director Thomas-Jacobs for any opening remarks.
Thank you, Emma, and really appreciate the opportunity to be with everyone here today. And thank you to the commission staff for who are facilitating and hosting all of this. I know a lot of work goes into putting these on, so appreciate that. We really appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with the PUC as we continue to build out the shared regulatory implementation of regular safety culture assessments on utilities. As many of you know, when the PUC was given the statutory responsibility to do 5-year assessments, Energy Safety was also directed to develop an annual safety culture assessment. Since our implementation started a little bit earlier in 2021, we developed it with an eye towards being complementary and informative to the commission's assessment, which I see is being proposed to be a 4-year, be done at 4-year intervals. Given our department's mission to our assessment has been focused on wildfire mitigation work setting and the enabling systems that work that go into that work, like organizational leadership and communication. We've conducted our first assessments in 2021, which included a workforce survey, a management self-assessment, statements on 1- and 3-year objectives, as well as potential interviews and observational visits. Our 2021 assessments were a baseline, which our 2022 assessments evaluated progress against. We conducted our 2022 assessments between July and September of last year. We're finalizing those reports and they'll be issued very shortly. This summer, we'll be conducting our 2023 safety culture assessment. Given this year will be our 3rd assessment, and given the commission's effort to develop its 4-year or 5-year assessment, in 2024, Energy Safety plans to reevaluate the structure and approach to our safety culture assessments which may change how those assessments are carried out in 2024 and thereafter, all in the spirit of continued collaboration and being complementary to these broader assessments done by the Commission. In the next couple of months, we'll be issuing a solicitation for a contractor to do this reevaluation. We have found our assessments to be very useful in getting a deeper insight into how electrical corporations are evolving their workforce and organizational safety culture, from one of simply compliance through a continuum of safety stewardship and eventually safety citizenship. I'm confident the Commission's assessments will also prove to be really valuable in driving improvements in safety outcomes. And again, really appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with the Commission on developing this. We obviously, our departments have unique purposes, our assessments have unique purposes, but we can continue to look forward to working with the Commission and the utilities to develop this out. Specifically, I look forward today to hearing from Commission staff how you guys envision the proposed framework interplays with energy safety's existing framework, and how the Commission can potentially leverage our annual cycle to inform the broader four-year cycle. Again, thank you for inviting us and letting us participate here with you. I look forward to the presentations and discussion today.
Thank you, Director Thomas Jacobs, and thank you again, Commissioner Hauk. And with that, I think we can get started with our presentations. It occurred to me that I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Emma Johnson, and I'm an analyst in the Commission Safety Policy Division. And I'm going to get us started with a brief overview of the draft safety culture framework that we sent to parties on February 2nd. This is just a quick overview of what safety culture frameworks are. Essentially, they simplify a theoretical concept into distinct dimensions so that we can understand and assess it. They provide a basis for the review of safety culture against a defined set of qualities. And in our case, as you all saw, this is the 10 traits that we are proposing in the framework. And here is just an overview of how the framework interplays with some of the other work products that we've discussed with this proceeding. So SPD used the feedback that we received in response to summer rulings and workshops, as well as the October 31st workshop for this proceeding, to revise the guiding principles and goals for the proceeding, and to also revise this draft safety culture framework. So the draft safety culture, The draft safety culture framework aligns with the revised goals and guiding principles for the proceeding, and it's what will be used to conduct the safety culture comprehensive assessments and any related annual reporting. So our annual reporting that we're proposing is annual improvement self-evaluations, which would be a lot simpler annual evaluations of safety culture to monitor progress between the comprehensive assessments. The process for conducting the comprehensive assessments and annual evaluations will be outlined in SPD's draft staff proposal. And then following the release of the staff proposal, we can begin the first round of assessments, which we're calling this pilot program. And the pilot program consists of the two tools that we've mentioned. So first, the comprehensive assessment, which is like a multi-method, holistic assessment of culture that uses the 10-trait framework that we're proposing. And then annual improvement self-evaluations, which are regular monitoring of safety culture within focus areas within each trait of the framework. As I mentioned in the previous slide, we wanted to provide an update that we revised the guiding principles for the proceeding based on party feedback. Some of the guiding principles were rephrased as goals, and these goals are shown here. We also added goals that parties had requested during the October 31st workshop. And there's 11 goals here. I'm not going to read through all of them, but all of you should have a copy of this presentation so you can review them yourself. And then we also have 7 guiding principles, which are for improving, 7 guiding principles for the pilot project and for the work that we're doing. So we think that these guiding principles are what our regulatory guidance and work with the IOU should adhere to for the safety culture pilot program. We know that we may need to revise the guiding principles and the goals after the first assessments are conducted, but we hope that these will guide our initial work on safety culture. And just note that the guiding principles are for commission staff, for the IOUs, and for other parties to this proceeding. So they're really for all of us. And so here's a little bit of an overview on our development of the framework. This was also in the materials that we had sent to the service list. So we based our framework on the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission Safety Culture Common Language. This language was the result of an attempt to a multi-year process to try to harmonize differences in terms that different groups used in the nuclear industry in the U.S. to describe a healthy safety culture. The Institute for Nuclear Power Operations also published this same framework and language within their Traits of a Healthy Nuclear Safety Culture, which is the framework that the utilities advocated that we use for conducting assessments. We provided a little bit of an overview in the documents that we sent to the service list on the changes that we made to the framework, but we really just removed phrasing that was specific to the nuclear industry and didn't apply to the utility industry, or at least not yet. And we also added elements from the more recent International Atomic Energy Agency framework in a few spots, and we noted, I think there's just a few spots where we did that, and we noted that in the documents that we sent out. So as we mentioned, here's just a summary of what the framework is. It consists of 10 traits, and within each trait, there's a number of attributes. There's a total of 40 attributes within the framework, and here I'm just pulling out the attributes for one specific trait, so it's continuous learning. So there's anywhere from like 2 to 8 attributes for each of the 10 traits. So today our goal is to discuss party feedback and propose modifications to the draft framework that we distributed to the service list. We also sent out questions related to whether parties think we should add negative dimensions, electric and gas utility specific information, and industry specific examples to the framework. So we'll hear from parties about this in their presentations, and then also have time to talk about it in the discussion session. And then following this meeting, the Safety Policy Division will revise the draft framework based on party comments. We'll also think about how the revised framework will inform the annual improvement self-evaluations and related reporting requirements that we devised for the pilot project, including creating focus areas and leading indicators that utilities can monitor annually within each of the 10 traits. This will allow us to look back at the annual reporting and track change over time when the comprehensive assessments are conducted. And then for electric utilities, we can compare the annual self-improvement evaluation to energy safety's most recent processes and annual reporting requirements so that we can avoid duplication and make sure they're complementary, as Director Thomas Jacobs said in her opening comments. And that's it for our overview presentation. If people have clarifying questions on the presentation, then we can ask that now. You can ask those now, and we can have a longer discussion on some of the questions that we outlined at the end of the meeting. So you can either raise your hand or type into the chat, and I'll try and toggle my various screens so I can make sure I see you.
Emma, one question. On the last slide, you have the bullet about comparing the annual evaluation focuses with energy safety. Could you talk a little bit about the coordination that either the PUC and OEIS staff are doing, or how we're going to you're anticipating we're going to work with the investor-owned utilities on making sure there's no duplication, but that we're also in sync and coordinating on these two different assessments.
Yeah, so our staff meets pretty regularly to discuss coordination. As Director Thomas Jacobs says, there may be some changes to their processes that we will have to keep in mind as we think about our annual evaluations. We also don't expect that we would do any of our annual reporting until after we do the first round of comprehensive assessments. We have some time to think about how to do that. But I guess it will be up to staff and parties to figure out if we want to do our annual reporting at the same time as energy safeties, or maybe do ours after, so that we can review energy safety's findings in our own annual reporting. Our annual reporting is really not intended to be, I think something important to keep in mind is that the legislation really only requires these comprehensive assessments, but our idea of doing annual reporting is based on the fact that we want the utilities to be able to monitor progress and have like a guideline for their own improvement. So we want it to be useful for them. If that means that they're using or telling us what they're already doing annually and just like reporting that to us, we can figure out a way to best leverage the work that's already being done. But the goal of these self-evaluations is really just to provide that guidance for improvement and not to just create annual reporting for the sake of annual reporting. So I'm sorry, that's like a long-winded answer. Isn't that clear right now?
I think so. I just wanted to confirm that we are coordinating on all these different assessments so that we're not duplicating efforts, and that we're trying, given we're trying to come up with this collaborative process that's trying to build a space for trust, and we've got ratepayers paying for all of this work, that to the extent we're coordinating with the different requirements for the two different agencies that overlap, I just wanted to highlight that and make sure that we're all sort of working together to make sure that the utilities aren't getting conflicting direction from different agencies, and that this is all about making sure that we're seeing results on the ground.
Definitely. Thank you.
And one, Commissioner, appreciate the comment and question. And, just to reinforce what she said, we very much want to make sure that we're coordinating and collaborating with you guys. Can I get a clarification on the annual self-evaluation, just so I understand what's being proposed here? That it's a self-evaluation, so it's the utilities would be doing it, if I'm correct. And then is it focused each year on a specific trait? Like I thought that's what I was understanding from the presentation here, so that there'd be like, let's consider it like a deep dive in a specific trait in that particular year, and their self-evaluation of that.
I think that's kind of similar to what we're proposing, but it's basically that we're not asking. But in one of the slides, we talked about how there's 40 different attributes. So we're not going to ask utilities to report progress on each of the 40 attributes. We're just going to select focus areas within each trait. So I think they would still be reporting something about each of the 10 traits, but it wouldn't be as extensive as looking at each of those 40 attributes. But yes, it would be a self-evaluation, and the methods that we would propose are doing just like self-reporting, and then potentially some like focus groups to come up with answers to those tracking for the 10 traits.
Thank you. That's helpful to understand. One of the things that we might want to think about is, as the commission staff that I know are working with our staff really closely are aware, is in our workforce surveys, right? Again, ours is really sort of comprehensive around the wildfire mitigation work setting, right? Personal safety, public safety, and organizational enabling systems that really lead to that work. So as it's being flushed out, what that self-evaluation is and how you guys, break out the progress on the traits. Let's just see if we can zero in on how it could potentially build off of the individual annual work that we're doing around that. On again, ours is wildfire safety focused, but a lot of it does have those enabling systems that are comprehensive. So again, to what the commissioner's point of, not necessarily having to duplicate that work, but that we can literally create interplay between that annual assessment and the structure around the annual progress monitoring.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I think we would want to basically mirror those requirements for the gas utilities that don't have to do your assessment. I think Melvin, did you have your hand raised a second ago?
I did. I was just curious if we see an opportunity here to consolidate the efforts, given that we are looking at culture, from a holistic perspective on an annual basis. Could energy safety's annual process help to inform or potentially even replace the annual self-evaluation?
It's helpful just that folks that are taking notes. So part of our assessment includes a management self-evaluation. So I think that's what Mr. Brown is referring to, that where we can, and to your point on that is, like, I mean, just so we can sync up the tracks. One of the things that obviously we would be looking at is to then get it in sync with you guys when we do the reevaluation in 2024, for 2024 through our contracts. So to your point, Mr. Brown, definitely we would be supportive of at least talking through where we can integrate that.
Thank you.
And I think I guess that one of the, I don't even know if I want to say challenge, but one of the areas where we would want to think about how we best sync up is making sure that any reporting, so if we do reporting through energy safety, how do we translate that into the 10 trait framework that we're proposing so that the information that we receive in the energy safety annual reporting, we're able to see how it relates back to that framework. I don't think I'm seeing any other questions, but I will hold off for just another second. All right, I think we can go ahead and move on to party presentations on the draft safety culture framework. So we have an hour for these presentations, a little more since we're a few minutes early. And our first presentation is from Cal Advocates. So Cal Advocates requested 45 minutes and the Joint Utilities requested 15. And we have the time to give both groups what the time that they asked for. So I'm gonna go ahead and pass it to Cal Advocates to get us started with the party presentations. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Emma. Can you see my screen now? Can you guys hear me?
We can.
Perfect. I just want to also make sure that Ben audio is working because he will be co-presenting with me a substantial part of this presentation.
Can you hear me?
Please, yeah. Okay, perfect. We can hear you. And you can see my slides, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you, everyone. We appreciate this opportunity to present. Okay, perfect. So our agenda today is that we'll go through a quick introduction. And by the way, my name is Mina Botros. I'm Senior UE in the safety branch with Cal Advocates. We'll go after our agenda is quick introduction, and then we'll go over our responses to SPD questions. And like what I mentioned, Ben Katzberg will be answering question 1, a substantial part of these questions, question 1, 2, and 5. And then I will answer 3 and 4, and then we'll go to the future steps. This preceding this OIR is focusing on the electric utility, natural gas utilities, and gas storage utilities. So, and this is taken from the scoping memo in April 2022. So I just want to keep in mind that also we need to keep our focus on the gas storage operator so that after we finish all these great steps, we don't go back and say, let's do it again for gas storage. So as much as possible, keeping in mind that whatever we can apply on gas storage operators as well, we can apply now. That will be great, so we don't go back and redo or reinvent the wheel after we do the electric and natural gas utility. Second part is regarding the questions. So SPD asked 5 questions. Question 1 is focusing on the tint rates, whether they adequately describe the most important aspects. Question 2 about the framework, if we should add negative dimension from CAR. Question number 3 about information specific about electric and the gas utilities. Question 4 about the industry-specific examples, and question 5 about whether parties agree with these modifications. We'll start answering those questions. Ben will be presenting. I'll give it to you, hand it over to Ben now. He will be answering question 1, 2, and 5. Go ahead, Ben.
Okay, thank you, Mina. So the format that we have in mind here is we have suggested some language to add in under the traits, either in an attribute or as a new attribute. I'm just going to go through that slide by slide, which for the most part is just going by traits where they fit. So we have done that with color-coded language here. The red text on the slides that are coming up, those we did not change. So those are just exactly the same as in the document that SPD sent around last week. We have 2 different shades of blue here. The more blue-gray or darker blue, that is language that was either taken or adapted from one of the CER defenses, or in a few cases, just taken directly from the US NRC Common Language document. The green text is intended to respond to question 2 of the questions SPD sent us. So that was whether there's a need for negatively phrased language or things to avoid. So the way we have done that is by putting them under the traits. I know one of the discussion questions that SPD asked us for the upcoming segment is kind of the best way to go about that. So this is just one way to go about it, is putting them under the traits. And the light blue language, I hope that's clear. It's a little bit more kind of neon or very light color. Though that language was taken from the pure model descriptions, which we saw in workshops over the summer. So just one thing I want to make clear is that in putting these suggestions together, we, for the most part, when creating a new attribute or something like that, We just put them on the end, so that's not supposed to indicate like an order of importance or anything along those lines. Okay, go to the next slide.
Yeah, just a quick thing that the key for these colors, we understand that it's kind of hard to remember. So we included a key in each slide of the coming slides. So that will be.
Okay. So first of all, this was when we were looking at it in section 1. I also think one of our discussion question gets at the independent oversight organizations, the last bullet on the slide here. So we were just, I guess, a little unclear whether that was intentionally removed, but if it was not, we wanted to call attention to it. So I'll go to the top. Under leaders, we have suggested crossing out a little bit of language, and the specific goal that we're getting at with that is to recognize an idea of informal leaders. So that came from one of the CER defenses, number 3, empowerment and accountability. It indicates a role for informal leaders modeling safety behaviors. And we saw enough value in that to be maybe formally recognized in the framework. And the second bullet point here under managers, this was just a suggestion for consistency in the revisions. In the document we all received, senior managers as a defined term was removed. So we thought that it would be good to just edit that definition to make it clear that it refers to leaders. If there are no questions, we can go to the next slide. Okay, and now we get into the traits. There were a lot of attributes under leadership accountability, or sorry, leadership safety values and actions. So this one's split into 2. I think to keep this from getting kind of out of hand, I will call attention to where we've added language under attributes. I'll tell you where the added language came from, more specifically than just the color coding. And if there are questions at any time, or if I'm moving too fast, please feel free to jump in and stop me. But otherwise, you do all have this document, so it may be worth, looking at in a setting where you can take a little more time for it. But here, okay, under the first attribute, resources, we added a positive phrasing from one of the CER threats, threat number 3, normalization of deviance, and this being to ensure that leaders are making sure that procedures are compatible largely, but also standardized and practicable. We've added another area to recognize informal leaders under field presence. So there are some of these suggestions are duplicative, either in the sense that SPD could choose one of them or could work with it however they want, add it elsewhere. We were just trying to call attention to concepts that we felt were really valuable in the CER. So yes, in this case, this was taken directly from the US NRC Common Language document. It was phrasing number 5 of field presence. If there are no questions, we can go to the next slide. Okay. And continuing with leadership, safety, values, and actions, you can see this format will, the upcoming slides will match this format a little bit better. As a practice in making these suggestions, we tried to carry forward some of the language from each domain under the pure model and find a trait that it fit under best in our opinions under this adapted INPO framework. So that is the light blue text LA.9. The name is, entirely up for better suggestions, but the language did come at least as, okay, this one is a bit of a paraphrasing, but the language came from the pure model as we saw it over the summer. So this was, again, getting at the idea of ensuring that there's a consistent application of policies that are compatible with one another. Under LA.8, the added language there came from CER Defense number 4, resiliency. Was just a very good approach for leaders to take to safety problems. And you can see LA.10 and LA.11, these names or attribute titles are taken just from the CER threat or defense that the language was taken from. The language itself was from the CER webpage or summary document that we all got with the workshop materials. So we just took, I guess this would be a good time to say the language from these. In that document, there are attributes listed underneath each of the CER threats or defenses. So this language, we just took those attributes and put them together into an attribute description here. That's just want to call attention to that. If we were to go about adding any CER threats or defenses in a different way, this language was originally more equivalent to each sentence being an attribute. We put them together just to have all the information here for everybody. Okay. If there are no questions, I think we can move on. So this trait problem identification and resolution we felt was very complete as it was, but we thought there was still some value in the pure model that was not carried forward. So we suggested just adding another attribute that would create a slightly more comprehensive approach to problem identification, focusing on problems that have actually arisen in the past. So the focus here is on using data that's available to the organization. Unless there are any questions, we can go to the next one. Okay. So here under PA.1 standards, we took this language from CER Defense number 2, vigilance. And the idea behind this specific sentence was really prevalent in, I think it was the just culture domain of the pure model, minimizing blame culture, removing presence of a blame culture, or just ensuring that it doesn't exist. That could be some of the value in negative language, but here we have it phrased positively, and that was, again, though the idea came from pure, the language came from the CER Defense number 2. This language under PA2 job ownership is also from CER Defense number 2. And that's about the perception of individuals really on the level of employees contributing to safety. This added attribute, PA4, this language that safety is viewed as an investment rather than a cost was really valuable. I think you could pretty easily argue about where it might go best, but just really good language to have somewhere in the model. Sorry, and that was taken from the pure domain profit before safety. And yes, we've included CER defense. That's number 2, vigilance, under this trait. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. So this work processes trait, we really appreciated seeing this. I think there's a lot of value in it. We just had a couple of suggestions to make it more thorough. This language under work process 1, it comes from CER defense number 4, resiliency. I hope it's clear there. We've got a lot of light blue back to back. The language, the kind of top light blue language is in WP4, procedure adherence. That was adapted from the pure domain managerial compliance. WP5 there was adapted from the pure domain leadership accountability. And WP6 here was adapted from the pure domain work processes. And we put tolerance of inadequate systems and resources under this trait, just because of a connection between the systems and resources and the work processes themselves. If there are no questions, we can move on. Okay, we had fewer suggestions here under continuous learning, but did have a couple. This language in CL2 self-assessment is another example that we took from US NRC Common Language document. That language was an alternative phrasing of CL2. So we thought including multiple phrasings, there's not really any problem with that on the level that the framework exists. And this additional attribute CL5 that was taken from the pure domain lessons learned and emphasizes communicating lessons throughout the organization and finding the area where it's most relevant. If there are no questions, we can move on. Okay, this language under RC1 was really largely a Cal Advocate's suggestion. It was based on the CER defense number 3, empowerment and accountability. And one of the things that we have been emphasizing is including contractors in this. I know that this document does that through the Section 1 definitions, but we didn't see any harm in, on occasion, calling attention to the relationship between contractors and maybe their point of contact within the utility, or just generally their point of contact. This added attribute, RC3, that was adapted from the pure domain safety leadership. And we felt that there was a good fit for committed safety leadership from the CER, that's defense number 1, under an environment for raising concerns. Essentially, that committed safety leadership creates a positive environment for raising concerns. If there are no questions, we can go to the next slide. Okay, this added language under CO1 that comes from the pure domain safety communications, and we really liked in the pure model this emphasis on ensuring that communications are received, understood, and acted upon. Though you know that specific phrasing didn't appear in the INPL. Thought that was very useful as a tool. This added attribute, CO5, that also comes from the pure domain safety communications. And again, emphasizes this language, communications are received, understood, and acted upon. If there are no questions, we can move to the next one. Okay. So yes, we did not add anything in any of the attributes. We didn't have any suggestions for that, but we did have the suggestion to carry some of the language from the pure domain just culture over. That domain really emphasized minimizing blame, which is, again, can stop employees from raising safety concerns. So I thought it was really useful to have that in the model. We also put some language from the CER defense number 3, empowerment and accountability under this, because that CER defense really emphasized empowering employees, which could create a respectful work environment. If there are no questions, we can, next slide. Okay. Here, let's see. 2. Okay. This language in QA2, we adapted that from the CER threat number 4, tolerance of inadequate systems or resources. See, it's a pretty small amount of language, but we just, again, we're going for as thorough as possible on this level. We have a suggested added attribute, QA5. That's, again, could fit in multiple places, but we put it here because the data collection, the idea of a questioning attitude, encouraging everybody to collect data whenever the opportunity comes up. That came from the pure domain risk assessment. And we also fit the CER threat number 2, complacency, here, in a sense because of the emphasis in that threat on overconfidence and inattention being kind of antithetical to questioning attitude. If there are no questions, we can go to the next slide.
I see
I have a quick question. Couldn't you just combine QA 4 and 6, your new 6?
I see. I think where that's coming from, avoiding complacency and complacency. I suppose what we were going for in these suggestions, which, came from the idea that there would be discussion on all of it before anything is actually finalized in a framework. There is, so the addition of complacency, the threat, in part is to respond to question number 2, but there is language that's present in that CER threat that isn't really in the INPO attribute. So we were really trying to give SPD and parties as many tools for discussion as possible by including different wording and different phrasing. I think we have a discussion coming up on what level these negative language would fit best on. But I think that to me says that we were going about this in the right way, just because we wanted to put these alongside or under the trait that had the most thematic overlap with them. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Mina, can we see the next slide? Okay, this language under decision-making 1. We took this, I suppose we did not add an actual full attribute from pure under this trait, but we did carry some of the language from the pure domain managerial compliance over here. And that again is just emphasizing the consistency of rules, standards, and procedures. We added an attribute from CER defense number 4, resiliency. It's the dark blue text. And that was an idea that was present in a couple of places under CER of redundancy. So that seeing redundant processes as a benefit for safety and maybe carving out kind of reasons to look for redundancy as a positive. We also included the CER threat number 3, normalization of deviance under decision making. This was about really the systems, processes, and procedures that the organization provides to everybody. I guess individual contributors on all levels of the organization, and that's including leaders. I think there are no questions. I think I have one more slide, which we're through all the attributes now. Okay, so yes, I think this is going to come up in our discussion, but we just even before getting the discussion questions, we did want to emphasize that putting the traits under, putting the CER threats underneath traits, there is some potential for that to be confusing, being negatively phrased, or behaviors to look out for rather than behaviors to kind of lift up and aim for. We just put it under traits because we found some thematic similarities and we wanted to put in at least some of the work to connect those two. But we would really understand and would support any way of including the CER threats in the model. And I think I'm passing it back to Mina now.
Ben, I think Jason has a question.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Jason, if you're asking, I can't hear you.
Is that better? Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
Thanks for getting. I appreciate you walking us through that. I had kind of an overall question regarding the changes. Are you able to, and I'll provide a bit of background on why I'm asking this. Are you able to elaborate a bit on kind of the overall goal with adding these attributes? I'll add from my perspective. It seems that the 10 traits already provide a normative framework that would enable exploration of the kind of items that's proposed to be added by Cal advocates. When we get to our presentation, I think we're suggesting that potential changes, additions could follow pilot assessments or the first cycle of assessments. And I'll share the reason I'm asking this. One of the concerns that I flag is that creating a lengthier list of attributes may result in an overly directive or potentially burdensome process. So, for example, could expanding the attribute list from 40 to, I'm not sure how many years resulted in, but expanding that attribute list create kind of a more detailed checklist of attributes to consider, end up having the unintended consequence, I assume, of actually limiting learning and improvement because it becomes more descriptive about what you're supposed to be looking at instead of using the traits as kind of a launching point to explore some of these cultural components?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I hope we get a good time to discuss it at the discussion section later, but I would be happy to address it a bit now. So a few of the goals that we had, one, we saw it mostly as a more complete framework to start that first assessment with. These ideas that we have added in, these attributes we have added in a lot of ways, they do overlap with existing attributes. In fact, in large part, they overlap with existing attributes. So the idea was really to create more tools for the organization itself, more areas of capturing the same information, and also for the assessor, really just more data. And we agree that we really don't want to have anything too prescriptive or descriptive. We see that as a really key value of the way that we're going about this, that the commission is going about this, of having those yearly self-assessments. We really don't want to be over limiting in that. This really was just bringing those ideas in under maybe more traits, but the same ideas under more traits, so that as really redundancy to minimize the chance of anything slipping through the cracks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I see Ariel raised a hand. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I particularly appreciate, this is Ariel Strauss with Small Business Utility Advocates, and I do particularly appreciate Cal Advocates adding DM.4 because one issue that I think needs to be considered is the way in which redundancy sometimes is considered to be a negative feature, given costs and other aspects. But N+1 redundancy also increases resilience. So recognizing sort of the pushback on considerations of redundancy as a problem versus a feature, I think is very helpful. Overall, one question about the addition of the CER threats. It seems to be a positive addition. The question I have more is about the phrasing, and I guess this could happen in a different setting, but I think ultimately, if it's included, I think it's important that the phrasing be more an affirmative description of what actions would want to be taken, as opposed to just a restating of those threats, so that it could be more affirmatively assessed of, are we taking the steps we need to avoid normalization of deviance, rather than simply stating normalization of deviance as a problem. That would be more consistent with, I think, the helpful phrasing in the rest of the sub elements. Those are my two comments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that. And thanks, Ben, for a great presentation. As we can see, Ben pretty much responded to question 1, 2, and 5. I'll go ahead and respond to question 3 and 4, and then we can move on to the next point of our presentation. So question number 3 is related to whether we should add information specific to electric and gas utilities. And like we mentioned earlier, is that we recommend keeping the framework as general as possible to include electric, gas utilities, and also gas storage operators. However, if there is a need to add some information specific, we should add them separately. So there should be specific examples for electric specific examples for gas utilities and specific information for gas storage operators as well. Question number 4, regarding the industry-specific examples, and actually we recommend that, we are supporting that when traits are well defined, which we try to make in the previous part in Ben's section. So that will help us to eliminate confusion. So adding examples so that utilities and assessors can benefit from, that will help to eliminate confusion. So we're supporting that, and we're happy to present on that in future workshops. The last part of our presentation is about future steps that we are also looking forward to in to see SPD proposal is regarding the schedule, the third-party assessor selection process, and the process after safety culture assessment, and the cost recovery. Some of these parts we presented our positions previously. However, we want to, or we are looking forward to present and to provide our feedback regarding the SPD proposal regarding those issues or subjects. And that's pretty much it. If there is any question, happy to go over it. If there is no questions, I'll hand it back to Emma. Thank you. Or go ahead, Emma, sorry.
Thank you. I was just going to ask a question that we put in the PowerPoint presentation, which is just to see if you had any specific criteria that you used for the suggested modifications to the framework. And then if there's any revisions that you think could inform maybe like focus areas that we would ask utilities to report on versus changing the framework itself, or even using some of the information that you added to help us when we develop indicators within each trait, kind of like a middle ground between what Jason said and what you all were asking about, perhaps.
Ben, do you like to respond to that?
Sure. Yeah, so maybe it's good for us to set out criteria that we used. So as a starting position, we carried forward some of our positions that we've set out in comments previously. So we have been focusing on the CER threats and defenses. So even before getting those discussion questions, we had wanted to, in some form or another, add in language from the CER threats. We did have 5 specific. I think it was 2 defenses and 3 threats. I might be mixing that up, but we had 5 specific CER kind of traits that we have been suggesting be included in whatever framework we settle on. So we started from that. We did add. We tried to keep things kind of simple for communication in this workshop or working group meeting. So we would try to assign each CER threat or defense to just one trait, even though at times the themes could overlap. We did that for purposes of discussion. We did the same thing with the pure domains. On seeing the INPO framework, we wanted to, this was really looking for value in the pure domains, some of which was not really clearly reflected in the INPO. So in that sense, we tried to assign each pure domain to one INPO trait and take the most relevant language and carry it forward. which, for the most part was just creating a new attribute. I think it could be argued that they would fit under attributes, but that was, again, for purposes of discussion. And there are a couple of places with language that is under one trait that is similar to one of the existing INPO attribute descriptions. We did not consider that a criteria for exclusion, because again, the way we're seeing the framework is that there's just value in being as thorough as possible. I hope that makes it clear how we went about doing this.
Thank you. And I just wanted to point out to people who might be unfamiliar with the acronym that CER is the Canada Energy Regulator, and they regulate offshore and onshore oil and gas in Canada.
Thank you. I don't think I said that at any point.
Yeah.
All right, if there are no other questions, then I will start sharing my screen again, and we can pass it on to the joint utilities for their presentation. So I think we'll have Jason, Tom, Melvin, and Elizabeth, and I'll let you all introduce yourselves as you start your presentation.
Perfect. Thank you, Emma, and good morning, everyone. My name is Jason Egan with SoCalGas. I wanted to start by thanking the Commission Safety Policy Division and all the parties on this call for their ongoing engagement in this proceeding. I know I've very much appreciated the opportunity to work with the people on this call to discuss and learn more about safety culture, potential normative frameworks, potential assessment frameworks, and really looking at how we can drive learning and continuous improvement related to safety culture. Along the same lines, I really appreciate everyone involved for their receptivity to dialogues, questions, and feedback. We definitely look forward to continuing that today and in the future. And then before turning to the questions, I was going to give a quick introduction for the presenters from the utilities. I've introduced myself already. I'll be passing it off to Tom Tahino at PG&E, then Melvin Brown at Southern California Edison, and then Elizabeth Peters at SDG&E. And we're actually just planning to walk through each of the questions. So if we could go to the next slide, I'll respond to question number 1. And for question 1, our answer is fairly simple. We believe the 10 traits adequately describe the most important aspects of a healthy safety culture. We'll discuss in a bit more detail later, but the INPO 10 traits have significant history and a body of supporting knowledge and materials. So we think that provides a really solid normative framework, a solid foundation for building out the details of the safety culture assessment process. As we were discussing earlier, we recognize that there may be opportunities to adjust, learn, and improve as we engage in further discussions, as we engage in the pilot assessments, as we kind of work through the first cycle of safety culture assessments. Those could be used as additional learning, additional improvement information, and kind of drive changes, drive supplementing, drive improvements. But we do think that using the well-established INPO traits as a starting point is appropriate and will allow us to move forward consistent with what's worked in other industries. With that, I'll pass it to Tom.
Good morning. Thank you, Jason. And some of this has been mentioned already by Ariel and acknowledged by Ben as well, so we don't want to like this pound away. That's not the point. We appreciate comments from everybody and participating. So we believe the edits offered by the Commission and Cal Advocates have merit. And we don't think we should necessarily add to the 10 traits and make 14, and I'm not hearing that now. Our concern is that the model at the highest level remains simple, accessible to all employees, and motivational in tone. And the idea is such that it releases, ultimately in a profound way, the best of positive organizational psychology. So there's a little bit of faith and trust in the process, but it's happened at INPO. So we believe that the truth to this approach will play out in the long run. We hope that our following slides will allay any fears or concerns you might have about not adding these four in a more direct way. Perhaps they might be more comforting, perhaps wanting to include them, but they do have a negative tone, and so we think there's a way to work that in such that it doesn't actually have a setback aspect to it as well. So we also want to remind everyone that there are other aspects to the proposed process that we have not yet fully explored, but remain an important and a complementary component to the framework itself or to the assessment. And these, we believe, are stepping stones on our collective, crawl, walk, run approach. So we're excited to continue the conversations about these details overall. And with that, I'll pass it to Melvin.
Thank you, Tom. Moving to question 3. So again, I think this has been shared earlier, but we don't think that we should add electric and gas specific language at this time. Again, the input traits and processes, as Tom mentioned earlier, as written, do provide a solid foundation for us to move forward from a crawl, walk, run perspective, and that going through the pilot process will give us the ability to actually determine what is most meaningful in terms of any adjustments that need to be made. Tom also referenced the kind of broader processes earlier, and that was included in our appendix. The traits really are just a component of a more holistic approach to improving safety culture in the utilities. We can move to question 4 as well. And again, similar to what's been already said, I won't delve into this too much. We agree industry-specific examples would be helpful. However, ultimately, we do think that as we look at the broader framework, there are probably some pieces that we want to prioritize in terms of development and refinement. Again, we want to continue working in a collaborative approach to working through these issues, prioritizing the ones that we need to take on now, as opposed to the ones that can be addressed a little bit later as we continue to learn more. So again, some alignment that yes, specificity is helpful. Not quite sure if that's the thing that we focus on immediately. And for question, sorry, question. We can move to question 5, if there's no question. So again, we agree with the modifications that have been provided above. Do have a bit of a question regarding some of the rationale and the goals associated with specifically removing the designation of an independent third party. I think Cal Advocates also mentioned including that, and not quite certain if that was intentional. Ultimately, we think that this warrants discussion. There are benefits that have been established by the history of INPO, which in of itself is a third-party entity that fosters self-regulation. We think this is something that we need to work through. We'd love to understand, again, SPD's perspective in terms of why that was removed, and then how can we benefit from an independent third-party body as we think about fostering collaboration, fostering trust, fostering learning, not only across the IOUs, but with the Commission as well. We do think that there's a little bit more discussion also that can be had around how we actually operationalize this within a utility perspective. Again, the traits are just one component of how we do that. And we think one of the most effective ways of doing so is really driving a collaborative team approach where we delve into the details here to drive some sense of alignment. And I'll pass it over to Elizabeth to close.
Thank you, Melvin. If you could just advance to the next slide, please. So first of all, on behalf of R4 Utilities, just wanting to really reiterate our appreciation to SPD for this collaborative approach and really being receptive to parties' feedback regarding the proposed safety culture framework. As you've heard, the joint IOUs are supportive of using the INPO 10 traits as the basis for what we strive to achieve with a healthy safety culture. We believe the INPO model provides us with a strong foundation for which to build upon and will allow us to draw from decades of knowledge, experience, and references. The nuclear industry has seen positive results and safety improvements to further support the use of this model. So as Melvin stated, looking ahead, as we seek to further develop the safety culture assessment process, we respectfully request this continued collaborative approach as we all work towards these common goals and objectives of improving each of our respective safety cultures in a manner that produces effective outcomes. There's a vast amount of INPO documentation that can be referenced and leveraged. And additionally, as Director Thomas Jacobs mentioned in her opening remarks, Energy Safety has been performing annual wildfire safety culture assessments since 2021, which can also be leveraged and referenced for alignment to avoid duplication in efforts and outcomes. So our main message here is thanks to SPD's proposal, we now have a clear outline and a strong foundation for which to build upon. And so the IOUs request that SPD convene subgroups to further collaborate on operationalizing the INPO model and building out the details of the assessment process as we've described. And so we just wish to continue to collectively support SPD in its efforts to develop and finalize a safety culture assessment process and further adapt the INPO model to electric and gas utilities. PG&E and Edison, for example, have experience operating nuclear facilities and can provide valuable insights to their INPO experiences. So we look forward to further progress and again believe that SPD's proposal to adapt the INPO 10 traits provide us with a strong foundation for which to fully build out the assessment process and other elements of the framework such as information sharing, continuous learning, peer-to-peer review, and independent oversight. So with that, I think we'll open it up to any questions presented to the IOUs. So thank you for the opportunity to weigh in.
If anyone has questions, you can raise your hand. I'm not seeing any right now.
I just have one question on the third party, the independent third party. Just to be clear, it sounds like the investor-owned utilities are in agreement there could be benefits from that third party participating in this, but that there needs to be more discussion on what their role is and how that would function. Is that correct?
Yes, Melvin, if you wanted to weigh in a bit more, but yes, Commissioner Houck, that is our position. And I would also add that there is third-party evaluator involvement already in the energy safety wildfire safety culture assessment process that can also be leveraged here. But I think that is our position that it needs to be further vetted as part of the assessment process build out.
But it's your position that I think, and just so I understood the comment earlier, that it should still be included in the framework, but there should be further discussion. Is that accurate?
Yes, that looking at the creation and maintenance of an independent third party like INPO could help support the assessments, that they could deploy and undertake the assessments so that you have an independent third party that's undertaking the actual assessments themselves and helping foster, support, and influence consistency and independence in how the assessments are undertaken.
Thank you.
I'd like to just clarify though, because I think that's a little bit different than how it's currently being done by Energy Safety, just so that we're all really clear. So how we currently do it is we have a contractor that works for Energy Safety that conducts the assessment on our behalf, and we work with them. The survey, the workforce survey that is conducted, we use another vendor that I think is probably more, I mean, they are a contractor with us, but it's appropriate to call them independent because we want to maintain the value and anonymity and integrity of the survey results. But I just wanted to clarify, because I believe what you guys are suggesting is slightly different, which is an independent third body that sort of independently conducts the assessment, which is different than how we conduct our assessment.
That's helpful. I don't have as much background on your process as a gas-only utility. But yes, what at least speaking for SoCalGas, what we were considering or suggesting would have value would be the creation of an INPO-like organization that could kind of undertake these assessments in a similar framework that INPO does it in the nuclear industry.
Yeah, I think speaking from PG&E's perspective, there's a lot of room for really creative ways to go about this. I remember Commissioner Hawk once mentioned academics or academia, and there's hiring an entity, there's, replicating INPO, which is probably, I'm going to guess is a step too big, too far. But I think if we use a sort of a classic brainstorming, problem-solving approach, we can really put some high-quality ideas on paper that will add to the organizational competency we have to get at these things. And I think to do that, in my mind, the next step is to actually get in a room and with a capable facilitator and literally brainstorm, what is the world, what makes sense for the state of California, and what's sustainable and what's not overly burdensome to the utilities or the commission or either of the groups, and that allows others to, that participate as well. So don't quite have the answer, but think there probably is something. It's the process to get the answer that I think is the next step.
Sorry, Jason.
Sorry.
No, Director Thomas Jacobs, I was just going to add, with energy safety contracting with DECRA in 2021 and NSC in 2022 to perform our safety culture assessments, I think that is a valuable approach. But I think our proposal is kind of taking it that step further with the overall goal and objective to have that collaboration, to have that sort of safe space, so to speak, to really promote that continuous learning. Recognizing that, the CPUC is our regulator, making sure that we have that area to be candid and really just flush out those opportunities for improvement. And so kind of building upon the independent evaluator role that's taken in the energy safety assessment to actually support, those peer-to-peer discussions, those learning sessions in sort of a more non-punitive manner, I think is our overall goal and objective.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I just wanted to clarify that for the group on the phone here, right? To just make sure that everyone's tracking on the slight difference there. And I'm, familiar with sort of the way the FAA is kind of set it up too, that has this sort of different body. And I believe that's kind of what you guys are getting at, that there is this third space, if you will, where there can be more frank conversations that don't have that regulatory enforcement threat, if you will. And I appreciate that comment. I just wanted to make sure that people were clear on the meeting here about the slight difference in how we conduct our assessments and how we use that, the contractor to do that.
Thank you for that. And I think your statements just hit it on the head right there.
Oh, I was just quickly going to say, so I think we might maybe have created a little bit of confusion by removing that definition of independent oversight organization from the framework. But I think the reason that we did that is because what INPO meant and the USNRC meant by independent oversight organization is a body that's something that we don't necessarily have yet in the utility industry. And that specific phrase isn't actually mentioned anywhere in the framework. So we thought it could do more harm than good to introduce a phrase like that before its application and implementation is really clear, because there's so many different third parties that could be introduced. So when we talk about INPO isn't technically independent because its members are the nuclear facilities themselves. So that's like not what we don't think that's what the USNRC was intending to convey with that term, independent oversight organization. And it's also distinct from, like Director Thomas Jacobs was saying, the idea of like a third-party evaluator that would report directly to the regulator itself. So perhaps something that we could do is just add in that term, because we know we will have to have a third-party assessor, and just be really clear what we mean by it, and then separately add a definition for a third-party organization that builds collaboration, which is a topic that we've talked about throughout the course of the proceeding. But yeah, we just wanted to be really clear about the terms that we included, and make sure that we had like a group consensus on what we meant by those terms and how they might be applied within our processes before we included them, and introduced sort of like confusion to people. But omitting things can also introduce confusion.
Thank you, Emma. That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, perhaps it's a process facilitator or something. We can come up with a term, a temporary term. Excuse me, Melvin.
Yes, I think it's important to note as well that when we think about the success of INPO, right, which has been demonstrated since its inception 40 years ago, a critical component of why it's so successful is in fact that independent body, right, that does foster collaboration, that does foster trust, the open sharing of learnings, right, without necessarily fear of repercussions, because the intent is driving towards safety ultimately at the end of the day. And so, ultimately, INPO in its current form probably is not something that we want to pull directly over here, but do think that there's definite value in trying to work through what does that look like within our context. How do we foster collaboration within a regulatory context? And then, as Tom mentioned, we do think that there is value in delving into that through a process, whether it be a facilitator or something else where we explore that, because we do think it's a critical component of our success in these proceedings.
Great, thank you. And I stopped sharing my screen so that we could all see each other while we were talking, but I was wondering if you all wanted me to go through the two appendix slides that you had with the cultural threats and then the INPO resources, or if we wanted to skip over those.
My sense is a discussion about the process and next steps would be more constructive, because I think we've all kind of said the same thing that we added in our appendix. So.
Okay, that sounds good.
Agreed. One point of clarification, just to note, so regarding the threats, I think the point of the appendix, I do think there's value in looking at it. We don't need to discuss it, but we just wanted to highlight that we are addressing the threats through the existing traits right now. So that point of redundancy, I think, is something that is worthwhile noting when you go through that appendix. So not saying the threats aren't important, not saying that we don't need to measure them. We are saying that we already are through the traits as they exist, as well as the process around assessing those traits.
And Melvin, now that you mentioned it, the other slide that we added was the helpful INPO resources. And I'm not sure how many had a chance to look at that, but that might be, these I think provide stimulus to think about interesting ways entities, other departments, third parties. And I'm just I don't want to make any up right now because I don't want to lead and I don't actually have one. But this, I think, provides good food for thought about what's the role of the possible for the state of California and its utilities. the first two.
Thank you. Yeah, it looks like Ariel has his hand raised.
Thank you. This is really helpful, and I really appreciate everyone putting so much time into these comments. SBA did not ask for time to present, but I do have at this point four comments what we've seen so far, and I could just take a couple minutes and just relay those. I think that would be helpful at this point. So I think there's one thing I seems like that we haven't necessarily addressed, which is how these traits relate to safety, the safety culture definition. So it seems like these 10 traits, while SBA agrees that they cover the important aspects, they aren't the same thing as a safety culture itself. So I guess my question would be, how does the framework relate to defining a safety culture? Because the subtraits sort of, I think, assume that there is a uniform cultural understanding, and an element that maybe is lacking is maybe particularly in the leadership element of this. It would be defining that culture, communicating the culture, and assessing alignment within the IOUs that culture, however it's defined by that particular entity, is actually understood and accepted and sort of assessed by all elements of that community. So is there, I didn't see that in the IOU comments. I also didn't see it in the Cal Advocates comments, but it is an issue of concern for us. I have two or three other things I thought to say, but I don't know if anyone had any feedback on that question.
I can try to explain how I would describe the system, and I'll see if that's helpful. I would define safety culture as the shared values, beliefs, perceptions, behavioral norms of the organization. The Info 10 traits provide kind of a normative framework around what you should aspire towards or what good would look like for viewing safety culture. And then the assessment framework that we're suggesting should be continued to be developed collaboratively would be, what are the steps and processes you would take to assess your progress towards advancing towards that normative framework or towards what good is. Is that helpful? That would be my description of it.
Okay. Yeah, I think the thing that maybe that should be added more expressly is that there is a within the leadership dimension, there is a responsibility of communicating whatever the culture is. And within the communication element, there's an aspect of having some conversations around whether the culture is met, or sort of how we are, let's say, adopting the culture norms or the familiarity with the culture, rather than only the outcome, let's say, facing elements of, is there more safety equipment or is there more safety behavior, but also the elements of are we adopting this culture from the standpoint of the attitudes of the community.
And sorry, I just wanted to clarify. You think that should be added to the framework, or do you think it should be added to the definition?
I think it should be added to the framework. That the framework itself should be considering whether the safety culture understanding is how present that understanding itself is. Is there a common understanding of what the safety culture intention is to be? What is the culture that we are aiming towards? And are we in agreement about what that, let's say, goal is and what that means? Not only the all the different traits that will be existing within a organization.
Okay.
And then relating to the removal of the reference to the IMPO term, sort of independent oversight, that makes sense, I think. But the question I have here, and this is something that I think SBA commented on before, is I think there is value in also including a trait relating to the way that the IOU interacts with the commission as a partner in achieving safety. I don't mean one of the 10 traits, one of those subdimensions. Then I think this could fit into categories 1, 6, or 7 that there should be recognition of the commission as a partner in achieving safety culture and safety goals. I didn't see that mentioned and I similarly didn't see any mention of the word customer. So while customer as a word may not necessarily be critical to achieving this, I think the customer is so central to the safety objectives that it is appropriate to think about where that term should be used in this context. Maybe that's less relevant in the INPO process, but I think the customer is so central that it'd be helpful to make sure that that word at least is integrated somewhere. And I think it may help also have the right type of just terminology. I think Joe, I heard say, I appreciated that this should be sort of inspirational and have a sort of a positive dimension to it. I think aligning that language would be helpful. And I think just the last question I had also relates to, I think, mostly effective communication, which is I don't see as much inclusion of contractors I think I'd want to see, which is that the community in which the culture is being implemented includes these contractors. I see that in the initial discussion, the scoping aspect of it, where there's a discussion of who's involved, in explanatory terms, and a relationship among roles. But I think in the communication element, it would be helpful to clarify the importance of engaging contractors as well, since I think that is an area of potential slippage. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. I think so. The next part of our workshop is just a 15-minute break. So I think we can go ahead and adjourn. And if people have additional questions, we'll be sure to get to them in the discussion session that follows the break. So I'll see you all back here at 10:45. We'll give people a minute or so to join, and we'll start the discussion session when it looks like we have critical mass. All right, I think we can go ahead and get started with our discussion session. So we have about an hour for discussion. We've already answered or addressed some of the questions, but we're going to go ahead and go through all the questions that the Safety Policy Division sent prior to the meeting to the service list, just to make sure that if parties that didn't present have feedback, that they can provide that feedback. And so the questions that we added are these ones in orange. I went ahead and got rid of the questions 2C and 2D because we talked about those already this morning, but we can get started with the first question. So if you have anything that you want to share, then you can raise your hand or you can type into the chat, whatever's easiest for you. But the first question is just on the adequacy of the 10-trait framework, and if there's any other traits or attributes that parties think we should highlight, in addition to the ones that were included in the draft framework or the additions that we've already discussed. I see Jerry with the hand raised. She
Yeah,
can
this
go
is
ahead and come off
this
mute.
is Jerry Schmitz with Southwest Gas. I'm the Vice President of Engineering Staff here, just and give a little bit of background. You know, I've been with the gas company for 34 years, and I've been working in safety and safety culture basically ever since I started with the gas company. And I sit on a variety of different committees, and one of them is the Pipeline Safety Management System Committee for that API sponsors, and it basically oversees their recommended practice for pipeline safety management systems, API RP 1173. So I guess I have a comment and then maybe a question here. But first of all, I want to applaud SPD for their efforts in advancing safety culture. This honestly is the core issue, and certainly in our industry and maybe in several other industries. And we've been doing a lot of work in this area across the gas industry, and I'm glad to see it come on some other sides of the house as well. And you know, when we get this thing solved, this is the holy grail. We've got it in terms of safety. So just to give you guys a lot of credit for what you're trying to do here, and everything along that line. At the same time, I'm aware, and I believe that SPD and maybe the rest of the commission is aware of all the efforts that are happening with advancing safety culture through the Pipeline Safety Management System. And, you know, that started with the National Transportation Safety Board, moved on to Pipeline Hazardous and Safety Materials Administration. So all of them are pushing, you know, to drive safety culture through this adoption, voluntary adoption, albeit that, of this 1173. And the question that I have then is, with this effort that you all are doing with this INPO framework assessment, how is that going to integrate all the effort and all the work that's being done in the gas industry along the lines of PSMS? And is there going to be a connection? And I believe that, but I think it's an important thing. And obviously, there's a lot of commonality between the 10 traits that you have here. The safety culture is safety culture. All the aspects, the 10 elements of PSMS, they match up generally with what you've talked about here. But I'm just curious what the plans are in terms of integration between this work here and the work that's being done on PSMS.
Thank you for that question. That's a really great question. So it's also an interesting question. The Safety Policy Division sits on a group of North American regulators that includes representatives from the Canadian Energy Regulator and some other regulators that we've talked about and mentioned. A lot of those other regulators, as you're kind of alluding to, started with safety management system regulations and then moved on to working on safety culture. Because of the legislation that directs our work, we are sort of inherently tasked with doing the opposite for the electric utilities, because there's no safety management system regulations or voluntary. There's no existing electric safety management systems in the same way that the entire gas utility industry has the API standards. So I think that for the gas utilities, what we can do is to ask the utilities to describe and summarize their efforts to implement SMS within their annual evaluations. And it's also something that a third-party assessor that conducts the safety culture assessment would probably look at, because it's so central to safety efforts. But the question of, will there ever be requirements for SMS for the electric industry, I think is like an open question that I don't have the answer to at this time. But I do think that because we have that external working group that we sit on. We can learn a lot from that group and how they are implementing this interplay between SMS and safety culture. And we also did rely heavily on API's definition for safety in some of our definitions and other documents that we've released for this proceeding so far. So we recognize that that there's a lot of expertise that we can learn from. And I saw Saab has more understanding and experience with this than me, so he can talk. I saw that you had your hand raised, Saab.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. My name is Saab Bagri. I'm from the Safety Policy Division as well. Just to kind of answer your question, Jerry, there is a connection between safety management system and safety culture. The way we look at it is safety management system provides you the tools, right? To basically, and safety culture provides you the, I guess for lack of a better word, the dedication and devotion to make your operations safe. So API 1173 outlines the, like they call it elements, which actually comes from the process safety element also has those same elements as well. You know, whether it's management of change, whether it's corrective actions, a continuous improvement. So those provide you the tools, and the safety culture provides you the determination and the attitude towards achieving a safety environment. So that's the way we kind of look at it. And they're tied together. We don't think it's one or the other. I think they're tied together.
Good. Looks like Tom has his hand up there.
Yeah, Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can explain what we're doing at PG&E. There is gas, functional area, electric functional area generation, and there is a common conversation throughout the utility and the construction of our PG&E Safety Excellence Management System, such that there will be alignment among each of those major functional areas into one common and cohesive whole for PG&E. And we see huge value in that, notwithstanding that occurring within the state of California as well. So we see this mutual interlocking, a climbing up capability of knowledge sharing and learning. So each gas and electric and the are participating in the design of that safety management system, which is based on 1173, Z10, and 45001. And we've rationalized those in such a way that we believe will lead to a powerful outcome over time. And there's a great quote, and I think it came from the FAA that speaks to the interaction and the interplay between the two, where the safety management system gives you the confidence, and as was just mentioned, and the culture gives you the will to bring that all to fruition. It's a great question, and as you can imagine, it's a robust conversation within PG&E. But our CEO is committed to a common framework for the company, and with a zealous target of improving safety for the public as well as the utility.
No, that's good, Tom. And I'm just an advocate for alignment here. That's really all I'm looking for. I just don't want to have the situation where we're heading down one direction with one kind of framework and then come and have to deal with another framework. As long as there is good alignment, and it sounds like what the fellow from SPD just mentioned is there is this recognition that these things work together, and I just want to make sure that we're all looking at that. So appreciate that.
Dr. Cooper.
Thank you, Emma. I just wanted to make a comment on the API 1173 and the safety culture work that we were doing. When we were developing Pure, that was one of the questions, and 1173 was very central in our thinking. And if I can recollect correctly, the topic domains were, there was a 40% crossover, and in terms of the criteria, there was roughly a 30% crossover with 1173. We went back and checked because of the questions. Now, because the way that this has gone now with IMPO and the trades that we've got from IMPO, one of the questions was, how does IMPO relate to Pure? And basically it's 100% on the topic. There's roughly 100%, and both models pretty much encompass that. I would suggest that with the IMPO model and the trade are in there, if it's reflective, if the Pure model is reflective and both of those models are reflective of each other, then that would be roughly about a third of the criteria of the IMPO model would cross over with 1173. I would suggest. It's just straw, but roughly. I hope that's answered your question.
Thanks, Dr. Cooper. You cut out a little bit at the end there. Could you repeat the last sentence that you said and make sure that you're close to your mic?
Yeah, I just said I hope that answered your question, that there should be roughly about a third crossover from the IMPO stroke Pure models of safety culture with 1173, roughly.
No, yeah, thank you. I actually think there's probably more, but I appreciate that.
Thank you. Was there any additional feedback on the first question, or do you think we can move to the second question? I'm not seeing any hands, so I think I'm going to move on to the second question in the interest of time, which is about the Safety Policy Division's modifications to the framework so far. I'm going to actually just go ahead and go to 2A, which is the question of what ground rules, if any, do you think we should set for making changes to the framework? And on a related note, how should these changes be considered? So what process should be put in place to consider framework improvements in the future? Should they be considered, for example, during the comprehensive assessments or on some sort of rolling basis? Something that I noticed in the joint utility presentation was that there seems to be consensus from the joint utilities that the framework is okay for now, but that sort of implies that there could be revisions down the line. So just wanted to hear some initial thoughts on how you think that process could move forward, and if there's any criteria for how you would want to consider updates if you find that the framework isn't working for you all. Jason, go ahead. Thank you.
I can start. I think, in my opinion, the way to approach it would be to run through the pilot assessments, run through the first cycle of comprehensive assessments using the kind of IMPO framework. Then, consistent with the keeping a learning open mindset, identify what you learned from that. Was there anything missing? Was there anything that needed more detail? Was there anything that could be improved? So I think that one of the key takeaways from our presentation is we think this is a good foundation. We're not sure what might be revealed in undertaking the assessments as part of kind of the comprehensive or annual process, and that very well could reveal changes. In terms of criteria or what that could look like, I think this is something that could be explored as part of the more detailed assessment framework discussion, whether or not that's a future technical working group, or as we're suggesting, a subgroup meeting where we could have a bit of a collaborative discussion on what that could look like. I'll say one criteria I think is important to highlight is the need for consistency across the utilities. I think having a consistent framework applied to all of the utilities will be really important in unearthing lessons learned that could be applicable to all of the IOUs. So I would suggest that we try to think of a way to do that at a higher level, not to do it as part of an assessment of a specific utility. I think that runs the risk of having some inconsistent approaches come out of it. The more uniform, the better. I think from my viewpoint, we want to make sure that if you have an assessment of SoCalGas and then you later do an assessment of a different utility, you would have a consistent framework, a consistent working process, so that the other utilities could benefit from the learnings and takeaways of the assessment performed of SoCalGas. So that consistency is really important.
I agree, Jason, and I think that's a great place for that forum. This third entity, whatever it is a great place to rationalize that or husband that or facilitate that.
Thank you. Did anyone else have any responses to that question or any follow-up questions that you wanted to ask?
I fully agree with what Jason described. And to answer the second part of your question, Emma, kind of how that could be, you know, how we can roll out changes in the future, I think we could look to the RAMP and SMAP proceeding for that. RAMP is something that was established, again, with that spirit of continuous improvement. I think we all assume this to be an iterative process. But once all the utilities go through their RAMP assessment, we have the SMAP proceeding that kind of builds on that formula and continues to improve. So I think that, you know, to your question about process, I think there can be some similarities in how we continue to evolve our RAMP process by using that, you know, that SMAP proceeding to do that. Something similar could be applied here.
So use like their similar ongoing technical working group process, but in this proceeding.
Yeah, and I think the main point that Jason hit was very important, that, you know, not to continually, you know, improve after each assessment, but making sure we go through the full process of assessing all the utilities comprehensively and then looking for opportunities to improve. But there is a lot of value in having that apples to apples comparison, so we can all learn from one another. It's what we do now with our RAMP proceedings, is, you know, look for opportunities to get ahead of it. And so, but yeah, just having that continual framework review after all those have been done, and, you know, just looking to those lessons learned, how we've done so in those proceedings, would be probably helpful.
Thank you, that's helpful. I'm just gonna wait a second to see if we have any additional feedback on these first questions, and then I'll go to the next slide. All right. So this slide's a little longer. We wanted to talk a little bit more about the negative dimensions or cultural threats. We talked a little bit about this throughout the presentations, but I wanted to ask the question of, if negative dimensions are included, where should they be included, and would mixing positive and negative attributes under a single trait potentially be confusing to the assessor or to utilities? I also wanted to point out some background on the Canada Energy Regulator's use of negative attributes. The reason that they did this, they said, is that they found that, and we've talked a little bit about this, that negative attributes don't always have a positive counterpart. Was their thought. So there isn't always a positive thing that they can link the negative attribute to. And that they found value in including those negative attributes so that they could, as a regulator, work to identify those cultural threats that were described. So we wanted to hear party feedback on that, and just to provide that background. So if people have any responses to this question 3, 3A, and 3B, we can go ahead and talk about that. And I see, Jason, you have your hand raised.
I actually had a question on the last part. You mentioned that the CER included them because they found that the negative attribute did not always have a positive counterpart. Was that with regards to their framework specifically? Because I think they have 4 cultural defenses and 4 negative attributes or cultural threats. Did they do a comparison to INPO and determine that there was no counterpart? Because when we looked at the INPO framework and the cultural threats, we thought that those were pretty clearly captured within the info framework. So I'm just curious what the Canadian Energy Regulator was comparing them to identify that gap.
Yeah, so I think that they meant just generally that there wasn't always like a one-to-one matchup, but what you've just suggested is correct, that their framework has fewer positive dimensions as well. It's 4 and 4. I know that in developing their framework, if you look at the framework that they have posted on their website, they did do extensive comparison between their framework and I think the US NRC's framework, and I think one other framework, I think the BSEE's framework. So I can look at that on their website after. But yeah, I think mostly what they were trying to get at is that when they do like inspections or assessments, they sometimes can detect threats, but threats that don't, just the threat itself doesn't always have like a positive counterpart. But we can also ask them for more background on that statement. And then I see Ariel, you have your hand raised.
Thank you. Yes, I do. I think that the phrasing is important. So I'm calling attention to QA4, which says avoid complacency. I think maybe it's the example of what Jason was pointing out to, there being some of them already incorporated. But I do recommend that the language be describing something kind of affirmatively be done. And so even if they are to be added, which I think makes sense in some instances, like the normalization of deviance perhaps, there has to be, I think, a way in which you can assess whether you are in fact doing it, not just identifying it as a hazard to be avoided. So that language in QA4, I think, is a good example of how that could be done.
I think it's also important to distinguish between what good looks like and how we're actually measuring. So the instrument that we would use to understand the extent to which there's a question and attitude, for example, again, using a multi-method approach, there will be survey questions, there will be observations, and there will be focus groups. I think that should provide sufficient triangulation to get to the point that's been raised in terms of how do we assess the extent to which something exists as opposed to the negative. So I don't know if the 10 traits, as we're thinking about them or as we're discussing them now, really is how we're going to be operationalizing them from a measurement or rather an assessment perspective. Just an important distinction to be made there.
Yeah, thank you, Melvin. That's helpful. I think that's a really good point just overall, which is that the framework itself doesn't have to include every idea or thing that we've discussed. There's also other ways that we can capture getting the same information. So I think that's something that we can keep in mind.
I think maybe something else too is when we're contemplating this is just as a data point, what does the INPO do? What do they do? How their standard of performance is equally as challenging as ours. How do they feel discomfort about ensuring performance without sort of a negative component to that? And that's sort of, I think the utility team is hopeful for some form of sort of joint benchmarking or joint understanding of what is best practice. I mean, in a humble kind of way, well, what are they doing? And then we can step back in a group and say, okay, does that work here? How might we leverage that?
Yeah, that makes sense. So the next question is similar to a question that we've already sort of discussed, which is if we were to use a more general framework now, how could utility-specific information be suggested, vetted, and incorporated in the future? So what we heard when we talked about this on the previous slide was maybe to use those ongoing subgroups or technical working groups to develop this information and make updates. But if people have additional feedback they want to provide, then we can talk about that now. And then the related question was, so the joint utilities suggested convening subgroups focused on specific aspects of the framework with IOUs, with the Safety Policy Division and with other experts. So we wanted to ask what level of participation parties want or have capacity for this sort of working group structure. Would you want to meet like weekly, monthly, quarterly? We know there's like a lot of questions that we could ask about that, but just to sort of better understand your expectations and desires for that process.
I would add bi-weekly to your list of options. There's a nice blend of pace, yet opportunity to contemplate and research and
did any other parties or utilities have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the goal here is, having sufficient dedicated time, working time, maybe as opposed to presentation time, if that makes sense, to delve into some of these big pieces, working them to some measure of conclusion, and then being able to come back to this broader group, to not only align in terms of where we're landing, but also to ensure that we do have direction as well. Definitely, there's a sense of urgency here. So even dedicating a day, an entire day where we actually get together to work through these pieces, at least to get started, I think would be helpful. And to Tom's point, iterating in between these sessions, based on the alignment gained in those deeper dives, I think can help us expedite this process. Not only expedite, but also ensure alignment as we ramp up.
Thanks, Melvin. I'm curious if any of the non-utility parties have any feedback or what they think their capacity or participation could be in a process like this.
Emma, I think that from a SBA standpoint, we probably have limited capacity, but it does sound like it would be constructive. I think the one comment I would raise is the hope that there's a way in which the information is brought back to the wider group so that those that aren't able to participate or don't need to participate still will make sure that there's opportunity for feedback in that. It's sort of not sort of predetermined by who was able to participate in that process. I see some head nods. Thanks, Mel.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. And I also wanted to ask if Cal Advocates had any input just directly. Oh, I see, Mina, you have your hand raised. Sorry, I missed that.
Yeah, I just want to mention, yeah, we are happy to join in this effort, and actually we're looking forward to it, and we will try to provide some examples or our input in this. So, thank you.
Thank you. So those were all of the questions that we brainstormed. I was going to ask if anyone from the Safety Policy Division staff had any follow-up questions they wanted to ask.
Hi, Emma, this is Ken. Just a comment generally. And we've been working at this for a while. I know that folks in utilities and the other parties have too. And all of our thinking and what we're doing in this is evolving, continues to evolve, and that's all good news. I think all the things we've discussed today are pretty good, and I think more pretty good, very good suggestions about going forward. But I think one of the things to keep in mind is we're kind of carving new ground, and not to rely on things like CER or even IMPO as the guiding document or the guiding process. We're using things obviously from all those sources, but it doesn't mean that we have to use all of it, but really to craft something that is, and someone said earlier about what is going to make California safer, what is going to make the utilities in California safer. So as we go forward in this, and I think this last thing we talked about as an IMPO-like group for oversight, periodic check-ins, that sort of thing is going to be really an excellent tool to use. And that's really where the evolution is going to come from as far as our group think is on it. And the last point I was going to make to that is I can almost see this informal group developing some sort of best practices inventory that we would discuss, agree on, and maybe accumulate some sort of a best practice handbook or list for things we can use as we develop this going forward. But so anyway, just a general statement. We're customizing something for ourselves, not rely 100% on what's been before us in the past, but really look at the interconnectivity and communication between this group as we go forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Ken. That's really helpful. Okay, so, and I wanted to also check to see if Commissioner Houck or if Director Thomas Jacobs had any follow-up questions or points they wanted to make.
I don't have any follow-up questions at this time, but I think the discussion's been really helpful, and I appreciate the comments that Ken just made as well. I think sets a good framework there.
I too don't have any other further questions, and really appreciate the discussion this morning, and look forward to the further development of it. I think that these are all really important points and considerations as we build this framework out.
Thank you. And then I also wanted to pause to make sure we didn't have any other follow-up questions from any of the other participants on the call. If not, we can move on to just talking about next steps and closing up. All right, I'm not seeing any hands raised, but you can see that we're pretty early or ahead of schedule, so don't be shy if you have questions. So the next steps, which we've already sort of alluded to, are that we are going to refine the safety culture framework based on the feedback that we received today. We're going to develop the content and guidance for the annual improvement self-evaluations based on this revised framework, and also think about how we will develop focus areas and leading indicators for this. And then also we will be working on the draft safety policy division staff proposal that will aggregate all of the information that we have so far. And I see, Tom, you have your hand raised.
On the first bullet, refine safety culture framework based on a feedback, is what about the idea of one of those working sessions? And we use that mechanism to craft that collaboratively. I mean, ultimately you issue it, of course, you know, but that might be a little quicker way for us to land on a winsome tone.
Yeah, I think that could be helpful as well. And I see, Melvin, you have your hand raised as well.
I was going to touch on a different point that may actually fit into this discussion as well regarding the focus areas. I wasn't sure if, from the description of the focus areas, if this was something that was being defined across the IOUs, meaning we would all have kind of similar set of focus areas, or if we're going to be taking into account relative safety culture maturity, unique context, etc., in terms of what we should be focused on within each of the IOUs and the process to get to that works. So I think from a process perspective, Tom's suggestion is spot on. I think it helps us kind of work through that. But is there, I would say, initial thinking on how we would actually define these focus areas and what they would be driving?
So I think our like immediate next step is figuring out the process for how we would figure out the focus areas. But like you're sort of alluding to, I don't think we would establish those without consulting with the utilities in the process. And then I forgot to mention an immediate next step, which is that we'll send the recording and the presentation from this workshop to the service list. But I see, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. Just a quick question. I'm not clear if you mentioned you will refine the safety culture framework based on this discussion, which we see as a very helpful and very healthy discussion. I was wondering if we will have similar process regarding before you issue the draft for staff proposal, similar process regarding the schedule and third-party assessor selection and process after the safety culture assessment and the cost recovery issue, because my understanding is that the draft staff proposal should include all of those. So are you planning to have similar process to what we have regarding the framework after that or no?
I think for that, we'll probably have to convene internally before we respond. But like you said, the initial plan for all of that material would be included in the draft staff proposal, and there will be time for input on the staff proposal before it's finalized.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Sorry for my lack of specificity, but if there's additional questions, we can take those at this time. All right. So I just wanted to pause for any closing remarks from Commissioner Houck or from Caroline Thomas-Jacobs. If you have those, we can do those, and then we can adjourn the meeting a little bit early.
Just very briefly, I just want to thank everyone for their participation today and the time and effort you put into reviewing the framework. I'm looking forward to meeting with staff and then meeting with the parties to further discuss how we can move these efforts forward. And a lot of good things were talked about today, a lot of good questions raised, and again, really appreciate the time and effort on this important topic. So thank you.
Yeah, same. Quickly, really appreciate all the work that went into putting this together and the continued collaboration between commission staff and energy safety staff and all the stakeholders and utilities and experts on the phone today. Really appreciate the work on this. I feel deeply that, this effort is a long-term, foundational approach to changing the utilities. Obviously, I work mostly with electrical corporations, but, gas as well. Appreciate you guys focusing on reorienting towards safety and the improvements that these will ultimately lead to. So thank you for all the work. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Commissioner Houck, and thank you, Director Thomas-Jacobs. And thanks everyone for participating. If you have additional follow-up questions, you can feel free to stay on and ask those. But I want to let everyone adjourn because I think it looked like that we didn't have any other questions. So thank you again for the time that you've all taken to participate in this proceeding, and we will follow up with next steps.
Thank you. And I just want to thank staff also, and Emma, you in particular, for facilitating for all the work you guys have been doing on this. So thanks.